A warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for this session. I'm Amrita Gupta from the Agroecology Fund, and I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Vijay Kumar, who's going to speak to us today about state and civil society collaboration to scale up agroecology in India. When the Agroecology Fund was founded in 2012, its mission was to help bring agroecology into the mainstream. And in just a few short years, we've seen the global agroecology movement grow leaps and bounds. But perhaps nowhere has it grown as quickly and gained as much ground so fast as it has in India. And more specifically, the state of Andhra Pradesh, which is home of the community managed natural farming initiative. Today, well over 500,000 farmers practice community-managed natural farming. You may have heard of this referred to as zero-budget natural farming. And the goal there is to transition every single farmer in the state to agroecology. Vijay Kumar is the advisor to the government of Andhra Pradesh, and he's been leading the state's efforts to scale natural farming for the last 5 years. Before that, he spent more than 25 years in large-scale community mobilization, working with indigenous groups and women's groups. Last year, when we could still gather in person, we had the opportunity of meeting with Vijay and learning more about the program. Nearly 100 of us from across the Agroecology Fund network visited India on a global learning exchange. And we spent time with the farmers and we saw the successes on the ground. And like many of the practitioners and policymakers and researchers who spent time there, we came away impressed and absolutely inspired. For agroecology to reach critical mass, we know that state and civil society must collaborate. And this extraordinary initiative shows us that it is possible. And it's also possible when we are generous with our time and knowledge and experience. That's what makes for a strong movement. And Vijay exemplifies the spirit of collaboration. Right on the heels of the learning exchange, he began working with our African colleagues, and they were discussing how to bring the natural farming model to the African continent. And I know everyone's eager to learn more about what makes this initiative so successful. We're going to save time for discussion and questions at the end of this presentation. But without further ado, over to you, Vijay.
Thank you, Amrita. I have very fond memories of the delegation that came to us, and we hope these exchanges will resume in 2021. So, given the limited time, I'll start my presentation straight away.
Yeah, please.
Is it visible, Amrita?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you once again, and I must thank the ORFC for this opportunity, and I must thank all the people from different places across the world who are watching this session. Thank you very much. In Andhra Pradesh, we have a vision that ours is a state of 50 million people and around 6 million farmers and farm workers. So our vision is to see how we reach out to every farmer and farm worker and engage with them till they transform their current agriculture practices into natural farming. So I will actually focus on how we are able to scale up to reach out to farmers and how we are able to have this kind of a vision that yes, we can reach out to all farmers. I'll start with the where we are. So you can see this is Andhra Pradesh, south of India, and this is Bay of Bengal. So we have almost 1,000-kilometer long coast. So very frequent cyclones and very unpredictable cyclonic weather in last 10 years. The frequency and intensity of cyclones has increased. The southern region is the semi-arid area. So where again we have the issue of droughts. And 86% of the farmers are small and marginal farmers in Andhra Pradesh, like rest of the country. And the average holding is 1 hectare. So this is the situation, and ours is a predominantly, compared to other states, the contribution of agriculture to the overall GSDP is very high in Andhra Pradesh, and Andhra Pradesh is also known for rice cultivation because 35% of the area is under rice. So this is where we are. And this is, of course, the crisis that we are seeing everywhere. We have, on the one hand, farmers' distress on account of ever increasing costs of cultivation because of cost of seeds or purchased inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. So these costs are increasing every year. At the same time, the riskiness of the agriculture is also increasing every year on account of droughts, prolonged dry spells, or other extreme, more frequent cyclones, floods, unseasonal rains, and the groundwater system is, at a crisis now. We have a serious emergency there. Then we have tenants who have their own problems, and then there is serious migration. So you have farmers' distress, very serious one, which is also increasing year after year. At the same time, there is a crisis from the consumer's point of view, whether it's a case of food scarcity or the poison in our foods, whether chemical residues or metal contamination or lack of essential nutrients in the food. So the food we are eating is not really healthy. So there is a health crisis caused by the food that we are eating. And then there is an environment crisis, whether it's a soil crisis, there's a water emergency, and heat waves, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. So these are the multiple emergencies which are actually coursing through the system, through the world. And so, on the one hand, agriculture is, facing problems on account of climate change. But as you can see in this slide, the current agriculture practices themselves are a very important cause of climate change. So that is the irony here. So the farmers and the agriculture is a victim of climate change. At the same time, the way we are practicing agriculture is also causing climate change. And you can see all these factors, whether it's deforestation, forest fires, ploughing, keeping lands fallow, and most importantly, over the last 70 years, use of synthetic biocides. So all this contributed to this crisis. Now, the reason why we want to universalize natural farming is we believe that farming in harmony with nature can be a solution to all these crises. So it sounds, unbelievable, but we believe that farming in harmony with nature, and the rest of the presentation is to take you through that, nature has solutions. And that's why we are focusing on what we call AP, community managed natural farming, which is regenerative agriculture. And this essentially is mimicking nature. Whatever over millions of years, nature has had a system of, the soil, the plants, the animals. So there was a harmony. So what are those principles of natural farming which we are, trying to practice? And these are 9 principles. 8 are positive and 1 is negative. So essentially we are saying cover the soil with green, with living root 365 days of the year, because we want to maximize photosynthesis. Have diverse crops on the soil, do not disturb the soil, integrate animals into farming, use of biostimulants, because the soil biology is now suppressed. So we have to trigger the increase in soil biology, increase organic residues on the soils, use indigenous seeds, and pest management through agronomical practices and botanical extracts, and no to synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, weedicides. Now, these are 9 principles, and there are, of course, practices vary from region to region, farmer to farmer, and something which is unique in India is the role of the biostimulants, which are able to trigger the soil biology in a very significant manner. And in Andhra Pradesh, the pre-monsoon dry sowing, which I'll explain shortly. So natural farming combined with the practices related to pre-monsoon dry sowing presents a very unique breakthrough. So in terms of practices, as you can see, this is enabling the field to have 365 days green cover with crop biodiversity, uh, maximizes the photosynthesis rate. And so this is a very, very important principle. And our focus is on enabling farmers to internalize this and practice it with whatever crop diversity they can proceed with. And this is a bioinoculum, the Bijamrita seed treatment. You can see here it's a cow dung, cow urine, lime, handful of chemical-free soil and water fermented for about 12 hours and filtered and then sprinkled on the seeds. So this microbial coating on the seeds is has very important implications, and it's helps the germination and establishment of the plant. And the other one we call the Ghana Jivamrita. It's a solid bioinoculum, biostimulant. So again, it has animal dung and urine and handful of uncontaminated soil, plus some molasses, jaggery, and pulses flour, fermented for 5 days, and then this can remain for about 6 months, and they are powdered and applied on the field as a basal dose before the sowing, and some farmers also apply it as a split dose during the reproductive phase. There's also a liquid version which is used every 10 days, 1 week to 15 days depending on the crop. Then we promote indigenous seeds. This is just beginning, it'll take a long time, but this is something we feel has great potential, and we already conserved and characterized around 400 traditional varieties. We plan to expand this work because indigenous seeds are very critical in natural farming. And so those were the practices. Now I'll go into the scaling up and what are those factors which lead to scaling up. And as you can see, when we started the program in 2016 season, 2016-17, we had enrolled around 40,000 farmers from 700 villages. Current year, we are in 3,730 villages, scaled up by 5 times. And the number of farmers this year is around 1 million farmers. This includes farm workers. So we have very special focus on landless farm workers. So we are taking both those with lands and without lands as our target group. We are financed by government, philanthropy. Azim Premji philanthropy has had a very important influence on our program. And this year we borrowed from KfW Bank. We've taken a loan of 90 million euros for this. And so this is a scaling up. Currently we are present in 1/3 of the villages and 16% farmers. Once we, by March end, we hope to achieve this 1 million farmers and farm workers coverage. Now, what have been the results of these various practices? These are our 9 crops which account for 78% of the area of the state. As you can see, rice is very important, groundnut, cotton, chickpea, corn, etc. So we've had independent assessment of the yields, costs, and net incomes. So this is for 9 major crops. And as you can see, there is really no yield penalty. Out of 9 crops, 7 crops, natural farming fields outperform the conventional fields. Only in 2 crops, cotton and corn, there was a yield penalty. There was a decrease in the yield. But if you see the cost differences, there's tremendous decrease in the costs, which for the most important crop is around 20% cost decrease, 10%, 36%, 33%. So there's a very significant cost decrease by moving to natural farming. And if you see the effect of increase of yields and decrease in the cost, so this is the net uh, returns, comparison between the net returns between the two systems. And you can see very significant increases, 66% for paddy, 24% for groundnut, 165% for cotton. Of course, in corn, we had a small decline of 5%. So the yield penalty could not compensate the cost decrease. So pigeon pea, of course, is an outlier, had 3 times the better net returns. But then apart from these, we are seeing improved biodiversity. You can see birds, honeybees, and we counted the earthworm population in a natural farming plot versus conventional plot, and you can see there's a difference of 9 times, 9-fold increase in this. And then birds' nests and birds visiting the natural farming fields, again, there's very significant difference between the two. And this, I just want to highlight the fact that we have, done a family-wise survey of this 1.3 million households in our program villages. And as you can see, 1/3 of them are landless farm workers, and those with lands are around 55%. 12% are in non-farm livelihoods. So we decided that we should have interventions for the landless, ultra poor farm workers, and we started with homestead gardens, and till last year we had covered about 2/3 of them. So this year we plan to cover every household through the nutrition garden, and some of them we want them to be supported for taking lands on lease, and government had assigned lands to them which were lying fallow. So because of the techniques that we now have under pre-monsoon dry sowing, so we want to see that they can develop their assigned lands and get incomes from that. So there's a very strong dimension, equity dimension in the program. So this is the the harvest from their homesteads. Yeah. Now, about scaling up. How is it that Andhra Pradesh has scaled up so significantly? These are the challenges. I think most important is a mindset issue, because over the last 60 years, 70 years, it has been told that without chemicals, crops cannot be grown. So because of this, there are also a lot of vested interests. But apart from that, the way the extension system is geared up is not farmer friendly, or we don't engage. The governmental extension system doesn't engage with the farmers the way it should be when you are bringing about a change in mindset. So what are those innovations in our model? First and foremost, I believe the government support, both resources and the government itself advocating this change and taking up the responsibility of implementation is a very important factor. And then the knowledge, because it is a knowledge package of practices, principles which are in harmony with nature. So these are very beneficial, principles and practices. But we've also made around 500 practice videos. We have developed package of practices around this, which keep changing. This is a very dynamic, the practices are dynamic, principles are universal. But the most important vehicle, most important system for scaling up has been the role of the women self-help groups and their federations, and the fact that we have a very different extension system, which is a horizontal farmer to farmer extension system rather than a top-down extension system. And then we have the support of facilitating organizations, government, civil society organizations, and farmers organizations, community-based organizations who are involved in a long-term hand-holding for this transformation to happen. And then, of course, we thrive on innovations, and we learn, and we learn from wherever we can. And this has really, and we have this mechanism of the self-help groups, federations, farmers organizations, farmer to farmer extension system ensures that innovations disseminate very quickly through the system. And then we have, because of the government support, we converge with other government departments. And this also has been very important, collaborations with global and national institutions, philanthropies, scientific experts. This has been extremely important in giving us confidence that we are on the right path, and also disseminate to other states and other countries. So these are the, time is very short, otherwise, each one of them takes a lot of time to explain, but I'll just take up the role of the women self-help groups. In India, in Andhra Pradesh especially, it's about 20-year-old movement. Almost 90% of women in rural areas are organized into self-help groups and federations. And it is these federations which are playing such an important role. You can see in our project area, we have more than 130,000 self-help groups and close to 5,500 federations at the village level. And they are in charge. So program management, collective action, peer learning. Because this is a mindset issue, so the women self-help group supports members who are making this transformation. Typically, people make fun of those who want to change, whereas the women self-help group supports their members. And that is the basic difference in scaling up, and that's very critical. And we also focus on leaders of the women self-help groups. We make them practice the natural farming, and then they are able to convince other members to follow. So by the end of this year, we would have ensured that of this 130,000 self-help groups, some are farm workers, others have lands. So our target is to ensure that two people, the two leaders in each group, become practitioners, and that enables them to convert, educate, help the remaining members in the group in this transformation. The second major breakthrough is the extension system. You can see here, this lady is a very, I can call her a champion extension farmer, because she is 70 plus, but she disseminates her knowledge, her practical knowledge to other farmers, and she mentors new champion farmers. So it's people like her that we now have developed close to 6,000 community resource persons at the rate of 1 per 100 farmers. And so they are practitioners first, and from their practices they teach, they handhold other farmers. So they're also trained in video dissemination, conducting farmer field schools. So this is a very, very important piece. These two pieces are extremely critical. The organization of women on ground and champion farmers to take the knowledge forward. Then, of course, we have plenty of ICT at various levels. This is another important slide, that this doesn't happen overnight. It may take about 7-8 years to ensure that in a village that all farmers change and adopt all practices. A farmer's journey itself is, consumes time. It may take about 3 years for a farmer to take the entire area under natural farming and then deepen, have, more profitable high-end models. So we see somewhere between 4 to 6 years. And this is knowledge intensive agriculture. This is not input based agriculture. So the more a farmer, she learns this, applies them, and then through experimentation figures out what is good, what is working, what is not working, and makes improvements, shares knowledge, shares failures with others, learns from others. So this is a journey. And the farmers enrolled 700,000 with lands, 350,000 without lands. They are on a journey. About 15-20% would have reached year 4 kind of a situation where they are not using any chemicals. Others are partial. They're still not able to get over the 50-60 years of the addiction to chemicals. And we are not giving any incentive. We are not saying that if you change, you'll get some extra money from the government. Then, just as the journey of one farmer takes time, similarly, the transformation of a whole village from one farmer to 100 farmers also takes time. So we expect it takes about 5 years. Now, during this period, that is where the role of a facilitating organization is so critical, and the partnership between a state and civil society in this continuous handholding is what makes the difference, has made difference in our program. I'll just have, because of shortage of time, I'll be going through the remaining slides quite fast. How much does it cost? So we estimate now that will cost around 15,000 rupees over 8 years. So our estimate is if we have to bring all farmers in the state, it may cost around 10,000 crores. Now, is it too expensive? What are the benefits? So here we have tried to see if we have government resources to take this program and complete it by 3031, it may cost 10,000 crores. But there are savings to government from reduction in electricity subsidies. We estimate anywhere between 30 to 50% reduction in electricity because you require less water now. So this itself means, based on the subsidies given in Andhra Pradesh, this itself could mean 2 times the transformation cost. And we will be saving government subsidies in fertilizers. Given the present costs and with inflation kept in mind, this is around 36,000 crores. That means about almost 4 times. So therefore, this is perhaps the best investment any government can make. I'm not counting the other benefits to the farmers and the ecosystem benefits. Then I just want to spend the last 4-5 minutes on a very important breakthrough that we achieved. We experimented 2 years ago in 2018, and that is, how can you harness water from the air? And this is a very important concern because we are facing a water emergency. And I'm thankful to Walter Jena, climate scientist, Australia, who inspired me to test this, that water in the air is there up to 50,000 parts per million. Can, through regenerative agriculture, can through natural farming, or can we harness part of this water to enable crops to be grown in semi-arid and drought areas? So we did this experiment 2 years ago. So we now have one window of sowing from April onwards, because rains in India start from June to September. So we are, sowing before the monsoon. So this is one window. And then we have another window, which is, is throughout the year, but more specifically after the first crop is harvested. So we now have a concept of 365 days green cover. And you can see how this program has scaled up, starting with 11 farmers in May 2018. Brave souls, because everybody dissuaded them. And then 2019, we could take it up to 21,000. This year, in spite of the corona crisis, we were able to take it to 100,000 farmers. And we're targeting another 70,000 farmers before the season is over. And what is impressive is the area, around 80,000 acres. And given this, next year we plan to cover 300,000 farmers in the first window. So this is a very, something which farmers appreciate very highly. And I just want to share a case study to show what difference it can make in semi-arid areas. This is a farmer from Anantapur. Typically, the land would be bare for 8 months of the year. It's only between July to October, sometimes spilling over to November if the rains are delayed, so August to November, that they will take a single crop, groundnut, and also have red gram, pigeon pea on the borders. So if the rainfall is good, because last year it was good, this farmer could get around 43,000 rupees net income. But it's a very rare thing because 17 out of 20 years have been drought years. So the land is fallow for 8 months of the year. That is the situation in all semi-arid areas, rain-fed areas. Now the same farmer, thanks to pre-monsoon dry sowing, has started sowing in this dry area from the month of March itself. And he has taken about 15, 20 different crops, cereals, pulses, oil seeds, then vegetable crops, green leafy vegetables, beans, etc. Then in the month of July, he could take the groundnut crop, and then following the groundnut crop from November onwards, again he took vegetable crops and a mix of millets, pulses. So what happens to his bottom line? This is farmer Mallikarjuna. You can see the way he's kept the ground covered. This is a mix of seeds being sown. And you can see here in these 3 seasons, each window has given him income. 16,000 first window where nothing would have come. Of course, 58,000 in the main window. But then another 32,000 in a window where again no income would have come. Apart from income, the fact that there is a green cover has enhanced his soil fertility tremendously. So this has the potential of more than doubling incomes of farmers. And more important is, the enhancement of soil fertility and its This is Mallikarjuna's plot this year. On 14th December, we had a drone shot over his field. And there's another farmer who has converted a fallow land into, brought it back to life. And you can see this, which was earlier fallow for more than 10 years, has come to life thanks to the pre-monsoon dry seeding. This, of course, this is a science behind it. This itself may take half an hour, so I won't go into this. And there's a potential that if we can cover our ground 365 days with a living root, we can have a pathway a different pathway, a very important pathway where the farmers decide this to cooling the planet. And that is the significance of this work. And we have collaborations with various international agencies to, help us in the research and also in advocacy. And as I mentioned, Azim Premji Philanthropy has been a big supporter, UN Environment, FAO, KFW, Global Alliance. We are also taking this to other states. In India itself, about 7-8 states have shown interest. And we are actively, I think, teams from Meghalaya and Kerala will be coming to us in the month of January, and Bihar will follow. But we're also very happy to collaborate with Rwanda, Kenya, and Mexico. And I must thank Agroecology Fund, Amrita, and especially Daniel for actually bringing people from different continents and spending time with us. So I think I run out of time. Thank you very much, Amrita. I'll close my presentation now.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Vijay. It's always so inspiring to see those numbers and that green cover. Thank you so much. We are getting some questions in from the audience, but very quickly, I just wanted to dial it, go back to this one point that you raised early on, where you said the mindset change, that's what's critical to scaling. And this is true not just for farmers in the program, but also for the government, for public support, especially when you look at India and the Indian context, the poster child, some would say, of the Green Revolution, so many stuck in the old mindset. Could you sort of dig a little deeper and tell us what was it that really compelled the government to get behind this program? As you said, it's not, a short program. So was it, the subsidies, farmer welfare, ecosystem benefits?
Actually, Amrita, government is also acutely aware that there is farmers' distress. Farmers' incomes are, highly risky. So there is awareness in the government, and there's also awareness that we need to do something different. So when I was heading the agriculture department, so when I went to the chief minister and told him that, we would like to try a different approach. And I also told him that farmers are fed up, but they are continuing in the old approach because they feel there is no solution. So then I got space within the government, because, no government is happy at what is happening on ground, whether it is from the political side or from the bureaucracy. We can see that, farmers are suffering. So there was space for trying out a different approach. And even, the chief minister told me, even if it doesn't work, but still we must try a different approach. And the current chief minister now tells me that we should take it to every village as fast as possible. So there is an opportunity. I also believe it depends on us, on me, for instance, on taking a very firm stand that what is good in the long run for the farmers, for the consumers, for the society. Even though I may be interested in the long run, I have to show a quick return for the farmers. And that is the beauty of the natural farming situation in India. We are able to show in the first year itself a very significant cost reduction. So a farmer enters into this very tentatively. If they have 2 acres of land, if she has 2 acres of land, she will try only half an acre in the first year. So if they see results in the first year, it can be cost reduction, and they're not very worried whether the yields have gone up or gone down. They're willing to tolerate a slight reduction in the yield, but the cost should come down. It should be seen as an alternative to high cost inputs. So I would say the government is not happy. Government is aware there is a crisis, not very sure of the solutions. So if somebody comes and says, I have a lot of credibility in the system. So if I say that, look, there is a solution, give me an opportunity. So government, gave that opportunity.
Okay, thank you. And the other point that you mentioned that was really key, I thought, was talking about how this is a program not just for landed farmers, but the landless and farm workers. So many sessions at this conference have, reminded us of the importance of land rights, access to land. And India has very unequal land distribution with small and marginal farmers. I think you had mentioned that it's less than half of the crop area owned by 86% of farmers. So I think, and this is also a question that's come in from the audience, is could you tell us a little bit more about the efforts that have been done to include landless communities, Dalit, Adivasi, Muslim communities, minorities in Andhra Pradesh? How did you bring them into the program, and what is that approach like?
First and foremost is the fact that in the rural areas, the landless poor, the Dalit community, the tribal communities, the minority communities were all organized. So that is the first step. Where there is a platform, they have a platform, they can voice what they want. So that itself, as I said, in our state, it started 20 years ago. So when I took the program to them, so we already had a situation where they were all together. And then we started with, for the landless poor, we said, okay, you have homestead lands. So can we see that we can get some income from that? And then we worked with the group leaders. We developed champion farmers from among them to take this forward. So it wasn't difficult. And especially during the COVID, they didn't have to go out to buy vegetables. Otherwise, they would have had a lot of difficulties. So, and that has given a huge impetus this year. The second thing is for the tribal communities, and it's something which, gladdens my heart, that there is remarkable success of natural farming because it's in tune with their own way of living. Crop diversity, they're familiar with that. They used to have year-long crops. So these principles are something very close to their heart, and therefore mobilizing tribal communities was perhaps the easiest part. And we are giving a lot of stress. Almost 45% of tribal families in our state are already part of the program.
Okay. And you'd mentioned that the thing that sets this program apart is the peer-to-peer, farmer-to-farmer exchange, as opposed to the system where it's top-down extension. And there's a question come in along those lines, where what about the pesticide vendors or the traditional sort of state extension people who are pushing inputs? Does the program involve them in some way, or does it have to counter them in some way? Because effectively what you're trying to do is put them out of work.
We have situation where the pesticide vendors themselves have moved to natural farming because they don't want to eat poison. But what we do is with the agriculture department, we train right up to the grassroots functionaries because this is a government program. So yes, even though they have studied in their agriculture college, only Green Revolution, only the chemical agriculture, but we train them. We ask them to go and visit the farmers' fields. So we are investing. We believe that there is a new education that is required for all the existing extension functionaries, NGO, civil society functionaries. Now vis-a-vis the vendors, that is between them and the farmers. If the farmer doesn't want to buy the pesticide, so we can't force the farmers. So we are giving farmers a better option. And the fact that we teach the farmers to make these formulations themselves. So those who can't make it, we have our own input shops. So there are women self-help groups. They set up their own enterprises where they prepare the different botanical extracts for for those farmers who can't make it. They can come to these shops. These are the alternate shops. So they come here and buy their inputs. So there is a tipping point. So if 15-16% farmers covering 34% villages are practicing natural farming, then this spreads in the whole state, even if the program has not spread. So I believe, because I've been involved in this mass mobilizations, that there is a tipping point. So beyond which, there will be a mindset change among the various vendors. So they also have to look at new businesses. See, if the automobile companies, if they didn't make electric motors, so now you have new companies taking over their business. So something like that. So the business model has to change. So if you're an entrepreneur, then you should see that, what does your customer want? If the customer wants botanical extracts, then you should, and they don't want your poisonous things. So it's not as easy as I'm saying, but that's the way. Once we acquire a critical mass, so we now have close to 100 bio villages in tribal areas, where all farmers, entire arable land has come under natural farming. So anybody who has some business sense will know that they have to change their business. So there is a win-win-win, because there's a lot of work to be done. I tell them also that you focus on selling their outputs rather than selling inputs to them. That's also a business opportunity.
And that brings me to the next question, which is actually markets. A few questions from the chat actually focused on this, so I thought I'll try and group them together for you. So some questions, is the Andhra government considering becoming an organic state, prohibiting chemical inputs? So sort of, I'm guessing, like the Sikkim model. And another similar question is, what role does the demand for chemical-free food in urban markets play for these farmers? Are you looking into PGS, participatory guarantees, or any other kind of certification?
The government is not planning to ban the synthetic chemicals and pesticides, because you see, till all the farmers change over, there are farmers who are not changing over, then the government can't say that. So and so that doesn't happen. So therefore my task becomes even more difficult. That there are synthetic fertilizers, synthetic biocides. At the same time, you have to build that mindset that we should not use that. So the idea is to take this as per demand of the farmers. So as more and more farmers join, as I said, when this becomes the mainstream, then there'll be even more pressure on these suppliers, etc., to change. So currently, the government is not thinking of banning any particular synthetic fertilizers or pesticides which are permitted by Government of India, permitted as so-called safe. For me, nothing is safe, but still, in whatever classification they are supposed to be safe. When it comes to marketing, I want to also emphasize that we are not pitching it as something to be done for the sake of getting premium. But at the same time, farmers would like to get a higher price. So we are seeing very local markets. So within the village, farmers selling, or neighboring villages. So and that is trust-based farming, trust-based marketing, because they know that so and so has not used any pesticides without certification, etc. They know that. At the same time, we are working on PGS, but I must say that I'm not very happy at the way the certification systems are, the state of these systems. They're not farmer friendly. So I think there is some work that we need to do in enabling a very seamless linkage between farmers in the rural areas and consumers in the urban areas. We are looking at multiple options, including traceability. For instance, the consumer should know which farmer, which village, what set of practices were undertaken. So this is work in progress. But as I said, it's not the only motivating factor. The main motivating factor is reduction in the costs, increase in the yields, increase in the quality of soil, less water required, and
Right.
every farmer knows that they are eating healthy.
And that actually brings us to the next set of questions, which are about costs, both to the farmer. What is the cost to farmers to transition to natural farming? That's one question. Are there financial incentives or subsidies to help in this transition? And along those lines, we have another question. I'm not understanding the cost of transforming farms into natural farming. Can you please expand?
Okay. First of all, there is no subsidy given to farmers who are transforming. So that's another obstacle. In the sense, we are not offering any incentive. Now, the cost of transformation is the cost of hand-holding. As I showed in that slide, it takes between 6 to 8 years to transform a whole village. Now, this means the champion farmers, because we pay the champion farmers, they are compensated for their time. So they have to spend 1 per 100 farmers. So there is a cost to that. So we have to train them, we have to monitor them. Similarly, we have to work with the women self-help groups, build their capacities. Again, there is a cost. There is a cost of monitoring the program. So this is over 7, 8 years. It costs us, the government. It's a public good in the sense it's an investment made by the government. About 15,000 rupees per farmer over 7, 8 years. It's a very reasonable cost, and this is a cost borne by the government. So that is the cost, what I call as the transformation cost. This is a cost borne by the government to enable farmers to transit, and this basically requires capacity building, continuous visits to their fields, answering their doubts, being present in the group meetings when discussions take place, or training farmers, taking them for demonstration to other villages. So these costs, plus the cost of tracking ICT, so and the cost of managing the program. So these costs are borne by the government.
And you'd mentioned that there's also a philanthropic component.
Yes.
So a question came in, could you kindly tell us about which organizations, which philanthropy organizations you work with? Initially, there were rumors that AP was working with BNG Foundation.
Okay, we work with, currently we are supported by Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives, and we are discussing with different philanthropies to support different elements of the program.
And the other aspect that you'd mentioned was a loan rather than a grant.
Yeah, that's right. This is a loan taken by the government. It's not to be repaid by the farmers. Government takes loans for a variety of purposes. So our funds essentially are coming from the Government of India's program from the Ministry of Agriculture around sustainable agriculture, and where both the Government of India and the state government have a share in that. And this year, as I said, we have taken a loan of 90 million euros from KfW Bank.
And a question that's, I think, on a lot of people's minds. Also a compliment, Vijay, you're amazing. I'm not sure who this has come in by, but please give us your view on the protests in Delhi right now and minimum pricing for farmers in India, minimum support pricing.
Yeah, I think this is a very important issue currently in the country, and the determination of the farmers to get things changed is remarkable, and they have a very strong point of view. So I sincerely hope that there are consultations, and then the farmers and the government come to an agreement on what is the way forward. But going beyond the protests, there's also a reflection of acute farmers' distress in uh, in in every state, and in my opinion, every country. So there is distress, and this distress, as I mentioned, caused by ever increasing costs of cultivation, increasing risk of cultivation. So, in my view, the long term solution has to be to reduce the riskiness of agriculture, to reduce the cost of cultivation to farmers, to we are eroding our soils. So we should have a system of agriculture which ensures that soil organic matter is built up. So I think you know we see symptoms, and we are tackling symptoms. But I strongly believe that we should tackle the causes. And as I mentioned, for a variety of symptoms which seem unrelated, the the solution is, are we working in harmony with nature? So as I showed through our example, farmers are benefiting in so many ways, and so is the environment, and so is the consumer. So there is a solution which hundreds of thousands of farmers across the country are practicing. So I believe that whether the uh, I strongly believe that we should tackle the causes of this crisis, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future if we continue with this destructive agriculture practices. Then we'll be in a much bigger crisis in future. Not future, we're already there.
And there's many more questions as well. So I think that we're going to go into a follow-up session, if that's okay with you, Vijay. A Zoom room. I think that we're going to move from Crowdcast into a Zoom room.
Oh, we ran out of time?
We're trying to be mindful of the time, and I think there's a lot more questions to get through.
Okay, sure.
But one thing that I wanted to ask at this juncture before we move is, what advice do you have for colleagues who are looking at implementing a region-specific, context-specific form of natural farming in their own countries? There's not just about scaling, but many other obstacles in case of, for instance, biostimulants might not be as easily available. Is it transferable, translatable?
There are two parts to this. There are universal principles. I mentioned 9. Some could expand that or contract that, but we are saying there are 9 universal principles. They are applicable across all continents. But the specific practices will vary from country to country, region to region, even village to village and farmer to farmer. So I do believe that depending on the context, we will have to see what kind of biostimulants work. I was very impressed with the work that's being done by Dr. Johnson in New Mexico University, USA. So the Sue Johnson bioreactor is very famous. And similarly, Elaine Ingham has the compost teas. So I know that there are very good examples of regenerative agriculture, incorporating animals into agriculture in all the continents, USA, Europe, Australia. There were outstanding farmers who have done this. So context is very important. You can't just take one solution from one practice from one place to another. But I strongly believe that these universal principles will stir imagination of people in different continents to find local solutions.
Okay. Well, we hope everyone listening can join us in the Zoom room, and we'll go on for a little bit longer. Vijay, shall we meet in the Zoom room now?
Sure. Is there a link for that?
Yes,
Is it being mailed?
it's in the chat box for us.